The metal shutter bit into Samuel's shoulder as he leaned back, the corrugated edge digging deep into his skin. He did not move. To shift was to invite the damp chill of the alley to settle into his bones. The night air in Halfway Tree hung heavy, a thick, suffocating blanket saturated with the sharp sting of diesel exhaust and the metallic tang of wet concrete. Every breath felt like dragging grit into his lungs. Above, the city lights hummed, casting long, jagged shadows that danced across the alley floor. But they offered no warmth. Samuel stared at the opposite wall, watching a single bead of condensation crawl down the brickwork. The silence here was not empty. It was pressurized, vibrating with the distant, rhythmic thrum of traffic that never truly ceased. He pressed his palms flat against the shutter, feeling the vibration of the city through the steel. He was a stationary point in a world that moved around him, ignored by the passing headlights that swept briefly over the alley entrance before plunging it back into darkness. He held his position, eyes fixed on the shifting patterns of light. Samuel lowered his gaze from the alley entrance to his own hand. He curled his fingers inward, shielding his palm from the damp wind. Slowly, he peeled his thumb away to reveal the $500 note. It was crinkled, marked by deep creases that ran across the face of the currency, like a map of his own recent history. He smoothed the paper against his thigh, feeling the dry, textured resistance of the fibers against his skin. It was a crisp, rectangular anchor, a sharp contrast to the soft, rotting debris. He held it up to the faint, flickering glow of a distant street lamp, watching the light catch the edges of the bill. The paper felt unnervingly solid, a singular point of permanence in a life that had spent weeks drifting through the city like smoke. He traced the corner of the note with his index finger, feeling the sharp, clean edge. It was not just currency, it was a boundary. He pressed the note back into his palm, closing his fist tight, and felt the paper crinkle again. It was the only thing he owned that held any promise of order. The note in his palm was a promise, but his body was a failing machine. A violent, hollow twist erupted in his stomach, a sharp, coiling sensation that felt like iron bands tightening around his ribs. He doubled over slightly, pressing his forearm against his midsection to dampen the ache. 2 days. 2 days of nothing but water, and the thin, brittle hope that something would change. His vision blurred at the edges, the concrete walls of the alley seeming to pulse in time with the thumping in his ears. He swallowed, but his throat was dry, raspy, and offered no relief. The hunger was not just a lack of food, it was a physical intruder, clawing at his insides, demanding attention he could not give. He tried to straighten his spine, but his core felt hollowed out, as if the marrow had been drained from his bones. Every breath was shallow, a careful negotiation to avoid triggering another spasm of nausea. The hunger was still there, a dull ache in his gut, but the paralysis of the last few hours began to recede. Samuel shifted his weight, pressing his palms flat against the rough, cold concrete of the alley floor. His muscles felt thin and unresponsive, trembling under the effort of the push. He drew a sharp breath, the air tasting of damp dust and distant exhaust, and forced his core to tighten. Slowly, he began to lift. His shoulders strained against the weight of his own frame. He reached the halfway point, his head swimming, and paused to steady his vision against the dark, looming walls of the alley. He pushed harder, his heels digging into the grit, until his legs finally locked into place. In the absolute silence of the night, his knees popped with a sharp, dry crack. He stood there for a moment, swaying slightly as his blood pressure adjusted to the vertical shift. The world tilted, then settled. He did not collapse back down. Instead, he reached out and braced his hand against the corrugated metal shutter, feeling the cold vibration of the city through the steel. He was no longer a victim of the floor. The alley stretched out before him, a throat of shadows leading toward the main road. Samuel took a step, then another. His boots scraped against the grit, a rhythmic, uneven sound that seemed too loud in the quiet. He moved with a stiff, deliberate gait. Ahead, the darkness of the city was punctured by a soft, flickering radiance. It was an amber glow, spilling from a food stall. The light hit the damp concrete, turning the puddles into pools of liquid gold. To Samuel, that warmth was a beacon. He pushed forward, his breath coming in short, shallow hitches. He navigated a patch of slick, uneven ground. He planted his feet wide, steadied his core, and refused to let his knees buckle again. The scent of hot oil drifted toward him. He didn't look at the shadows behind him. He kept his gaze fixed on that amber circle, It was a promise of survival. He reached the edge of the alley, his shadow stretching long toward the light, and stopped at the threshold of the glow. The stall was a small island of activity in the cooling night. Samuel remained still, his presence registering as nothing more than a flicker in the vendor's periphery. The man stood behind a heavy counter, his movements practiced and rhythmic. He reached into a bubbling pot, the steam rising in thick, swirling clouds that obscured his face for a heartbeat. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, his hands working the ladle with the precision of a man who had done this for decades. He did not look up immediately. He scraped the bottom of the iron vessel, the metallic clatter cutting through the low hum of the street. Then he paused. He wiped his palms on his sides and shifted his weight, his gaze finally lifting to scan the immediate area. His eyes swept over the empty street before landing on Samuel. There was no recognition, no warmth. Only the steady, assessing look of a man who controlled the resources Samuel desperately needed. He held the ladle suspended over the pot, a drop of dark liquid falling back into the broth with a soft splash. He was the barrier between Samuel and the sustenance he craved. He stood as a silent, immovable fixture, waiting for the first word to be spoken, his posture suggesting that he had seen 1,000 desperate faces before and would see 1,000 more. Samuel stood at the edge of the amber light, his body trembling under the weight of his own exhaustion. Every nerve ending felt raw, exposed to the cooling night air. He tried to take a step, but his legs refused to obey. His muscles were tight, knotted cords that had long since run out of energy. He leaned forward, his center of gravity shifting, and forced his right boot to slide across the rough concrete. The sound was a harsh, scraping rasp that echoed. He dragged his left foot to catch up, the grit beneath his soles grinding with every inch of progress. His knees buckled, threatening to drop him to the pavement, but he locked them with a sharp, involuntary jerk. He focused entirely on the space between his feet and the base of the stall. He was moving, but it was a slow, agonizing crawl. He felt the heat from the cooking station radiating against his skin. Each movement was a battle against his own failing frame. He reached the counter, and his hand shot out, fingers curling around the cold, slick metal edge to steady himself. The world tilted sideways. For a heartbeat, the amber light flared into a blinding white, and the smell of the bubbling pot became overwhelming, thick with spices and rendered fat. He squeezed his eyes shut, fighting the sudden rush of nausea that threatened to pull him down to the concrete. He held his breath, waiting for the spinning to stop, his knuckles white against the metal. He felt the vendor's gaze shift. Samuel opened his eyes. The world snapped back into focus, sharp and unforgiving. He looked up, his chin trembling. He pushed air up from his hollow chest, past the tightness in his throat. The sound that emerged was thin, jagged. "Food," he said. The word hung in the air, a raw, exposed plea. He kept his eyes fixed on the vendor, waiting for the man to acknowledge the sound. The vendor did not soften. He did not offer a nod of pity or a gesture of understanding. Instead, he shifted his weight, the floorboards beneath him groaning under the movement. He reached out with a wooden spoon, the handle worn smooth by years of use, and tapped it against a handwritten menu board. The wood clattered against the metal frame, a sharp, rhythmic sound that cut through the ambient city noise. Samuel followed the motion, his eyes tracking the tip of the spoon until it landed on a chalked line of text. The vendor leaned forward, his face obscured by the rising steam from the pot. He spoke, his voice flat. "200 for a plate, boy." The words hit Samuel with the force of a physical blow. He stared at the board, the numbers swimming in his vision. The vendor waited, his hands still gripping the spoon, his gaze fixed on Samuel as if he were merely another obstacle. Samuel looked down at the $500 note crinkled in his palm. The paper felt thin, almost fragile, yet it held the only bridge between his current state and the void. Inside his stomach, a violent, hollow twist surged, a physical reminder of 2 days spent on nothing but water and hope. The sensation was not merely a craving. It was a roaring fire, a living entity demanding he consume every cent to silence the agony. He felt the heat of the fire crawling up his throat, a sharp, acidic pressure that made his vision pulse. The logic of the hunger was absolute. It dictated that the entire 500 belonged to the void, that spending it all was the only way to finally stop the gnawing, clawing pain at his ribs. He looked at the vendor, then back to the note, his thumb rubbing the edge of the bill until the friction burned his skin. The fire inside him screamed for total surrender. It demanded he trade the entire sum for a moment of relief, to drown the emptiness in a single, desperate act. He stood frozen, the note trembling in his grip, caught in the suffocating pull of his own physical desperation. The fire inside him flared one last time, a sharp, twisting cramp that forced his hand to move. Samuel stepped forward, his boots scraping against the grit of the alley floor. He held the $500 note out, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the vendor's calloused palm. The paper felt like a lifeline being severed. He watched the money disappear into the vendor's hand, the loss of it hitting him with a sudden, hollow clarity. He was handing over his only shield. He felt the remaining $300 in his pocket, the texture of the paper pressing against his thigh. The vendor did not acknowledge the weight of the moment. He simply tucked the note away and reached for the ladle. Samuel stood still, his breath hitching in his chest. He had made the exchange. The vendor turned toward the bubbling pot, his movements practiced and devoid of sentiment. He gripped a heavy metal ladle, the handle worn smooth by years of repetitive labor. With a sharp, metallic scrape, he plunged the tool into the steaming depths of the pot. He pulled it out, a mountain of white rice cascading off the edges, and dropped it onto the plastic plate with a soft, heavy thud. Samuel watched the steam rise, curling into the cool night air. The vendor reached for a second ladle, this one smaller and stained dark. He poured it slowly over the mound of rice. The dark liquid pooled, soaking into the grains and turning them a deep, rich brown. He added a generous piece of chicken, the skin glistening under the harsh, flickering street lamp. The meat was tender, the edges charred. The vendor tapped the edge of the plate twice. Samuel felt his pulse quicken, his focus narrowing until the world was nothing but that plate. The steam rose from the plate in thick, swirling ribbons, carrying the scent of roasted chicken and savory spices directly into the alleyway. It hit Samuel like a physical blow. The aroma was not just a smell. It was a weight that pressed against his chest, forcing his lungs to expand and contract in rapid, shallow bursts. He leaned forward, his nose twitching, as the heavy, salty fragrance of the gravy saturated the air around him. It felt thick enough to touch, a tangible cloud that clung to his skin and filled his mouth with the phantom taste of salt and fat. His stomach tightened, a sharp, twisting knot that demanded immediate satisfaction. He reached out, his fingers hovering inches from the plate, but the sheer intensity of the smell made him hesitate. It was overwhelming, a sensory assault that blurred the edges of his vision and made the street lamp above seem to dim. He swallowed hard, his throat dry and aching, as the scent swirled around his head, pulling at his focus and threatening to shatter his resolve. Every nerve in his body vibrated with the urge to grab the food and consume it in one frantic motion. He stood frozen, caught in the grip of a hunger that had become a living, breathing presence in the dark. The vendor slid the plate across the metal counter. Samuel caught it with both hands. The heat was immediate. A sharp, searing warmth that traveled through the thin plastic and bit into his palms. He did not pull away. Instead, he gripped the edges tighter, letting the temperature ground him. He turned away from the stall, his boots scuffing against the uneven pavement of the alley. His eyes scanned the shadows for a place to rest. He spotted a wooden crate overturned near a pile of discarded cardboard. He walked toward it, his gait stiff, keeping the plate level to prevent the gravy from spilling. He reached the crate and tested its stability with the toe of his boot. It wobbled, the wood groaning under the pressure. He adjusted his stance, locked his knees, and lowered himself slowly. The hunger remained, but the frantic movement of his hands had finally ceased. Samuel sat motionless on the crate, the world around him narrowing down to the plastic plate in his lap. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and lifted a single piece of chicken from the mound of rice. He held it up, bringing it into the direct, harsh glare of the street lamp above. The skin glistened, coated in a layer of dark, shimmering gravy that caught the amber light and held it. It was a perfect, golden surface, reflecting the glow like polished amber. To his eyes, starved and weary, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He rotated his wrist, watching the light dance across the jagged edges of the meat and the translucent sheen of the fat. Every detail stood out with unnatural clarity. The texture of the skin, the deep mahogany hue of the sauce, the way the steam curled away from the surface. He stared at it, his breath hitching in his chest. The hunger was a dull ache now, pushed into the background by the sheer intensity of his observation. The silence of the alley felt absolute, a heavy blanket pressing against his ears. Samuel watched the steam rise, his mouth watering, his muscles coiled to take the first bite. Then, the sound of the city seemed to drop away entirely. In that sudden vacuum, a voice echoed in his mind, sharp and clear as a bell. It was the stranger from the station, the man with the weathered face and the steady, unblinking eyes. "Don't spend it all," the voice commanded, vibrating through his memory. Samuel froze. The chicken remained suspended in the air, a tiny, golden weight between his fingers. The memory was not just a thought. It was a cold, sharp intrusion that sliced through his ravenous hunger. He felt his pulse thrumming in his fingertips. The image of the stranger's face flickered in his mind, superimposed over the glistening gravy. The hunger that had been a roaring fire now flickered. He did not move. He did not pull the meat closer. He sat perfectly still, the words repeating in his head, turning the simple act of eating into a test of his own resolve. He looked down at the remaining bills in his pocket, then back at the plate, his jaw tight, his resolve wavering between relief and the stranger's cryptic advice. The chicken hovered, suspended in the amber light, inches from his parted lips. Samuel felt his arm muscles lock, a sudden, rigid tension that refused to let the hand move forward or back. Time seemed to drag, the seconds stretching until each one felt like a heavy physical weight pressing against his skin. The steam from the plate curled upward, moving with a sluggish, hypnotic slowness that mirrored the stalling of his own intent. He could hear the distant, rhythmic hum of the city, but it sounded muffled, as if he were underwater. His fingers, gripping the meat, were white-knuckled and trembling. He caught the vendor's gaze from across the stall. The man was watching him with a flat, impatient curiosity, his wooden spoon resting against the rim of the pot. Samuel did not look away, yet he could not acknowledge the man. He was trapped in the gap between the immediate, clawing demand of his stomach and the cold, lingering echo of the warning. He remained caught in that singular, agonizing moment of hesitation, the golden meat gleaming under the street lamp, while the world waited for him to break the silence. Samuel finally lowered his hand. The chicken dropped back onto the plastic plate with a soft, wet thud. He did not look at the vendor, who had already turned his attention to a new customer. Instead, Samuel reached into his pocket. His thumb brushed the texture of the remaining bills, the paper crisp and cool against his calloused skin. He pulled them out, shielding the money from the street lamp's glare with his palm. $300. It was a thin, fragile stack, yet it felt heavier than the meal he had just purchased. He looked at the money, then back at the plate of food. The logic of his hunger roared, a primal demand to finish the meal and silence the ache in his ribs. But the math of his life was shifting. He realized that if he spent the rest, he would be full for an hour and empty by morning. This was not just currency, it was a boundary. To hold on to it was to acknowledge a different path, however uncertain. He held the money tight, his decision hardening in his chest like iron. The $300 in his palm felt less like paper and more like a key. Samuel stared at the bills, the texture grounding him against the chaotic pulse of Halfway Tree. The hunger in his stomach was still a sharp, gnawing ache, but the frantic, animal desperation that had driven him all day began to recede. He looked up at the passing traffic, the headlights cutting through the darkness, and for the first time he did not see them as obstacles or threats. He saw them as a world he was no longer excluded from. If he spent the money, he would be back to zero by dawn, a ghost in the alleyway. But by keeping it, he was drawing a line in the dirt. He was choosing to be someone who could plan, someone who could wait, someone who could survive into the next day and the day after that. The realization settled into his bones, cooling the heat of his frustration. He was no longer just a boy waiting for the next meal. He was a person with a stake in his own future. He tucked the money deep into his pocket, pressing his hand against the fabric to ensure it stayed there. The alley felt different now. Samuel looked down at the chicken. The skin was golden, glistening with oil under the harsh street lamp. He reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as they touched the meat. He did not lift the whole piece to his mouth. Instead, he pressed his thumb into the soft, cooked flesh and pulled. A small strip of meat came away, leaving the bone exposed. He set the bone down on the plastic plate, the sound sharp against the ambient noise of the street. He repeated the motion. He tore the chicken into tiny, jagged fragments, laying them out in a row across the plastic. Each piece was no larger than a coin. He worked with a surgical, almost obsessive focus, ignoring the way his stomach spasmed at the sight of the food. He was not just preparing a meal. He was dismantling his own impulse. He stripped the meat from the cartilage, his movements becoming more precise. He looked at the plate. It was no longer a single serving of dinner, but a series of measured, deliberate units of energy. Samuel picked up the first fragment of meat. It was small, barely enough to coat his tongue, yet his jaw locked in anticipation. He placed the piece on his tongue and closed his mouth. Instantly, his throat tightened. His body demanded he swallow, a reflexive, violent urge to gulp the food down and reach for the next piece. He fought it. He held the meat against his palate, feeling the salt and the heat of the gravy. He forced his jaw to move, once, twice, 3 times. The texture was fibrous, resisting his teeth. He focused entirely on the rhythm of the grinding, ignoring the hollow ache in his ribs. He counted the chews, forcing himself to reach 20 before letting the morsel slide down his throat. It felt like a deliberate, agonizing victory. He paused, his hand hovering over the plate, waiting for the frantic pulse in his chest to settle. His stomach spasmed, a sharp protest against the delay, but he did not rush. He reached for the second piece, his movements slow and measured. He was starving, but he was no longer a slave to the hunger. Samuel swallowed the final fragment of meat. His plate was empty, save for a few streaks of dark gravy. He stood up, his legs feeling unsteady against the pavement. He approached the vendor, who was already wiping down the counter. The man did not look up, his eyes fixed on the bubbling pot. Samuel reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the crinkled paper. He pulled out the $500 note. His hand shook, a fine rhythmic tremor that made the paper flutter in the humid air. He held the bill out, but his grip remained firm. He needed to break it. He looked at the vendor, who paused, his gaze shifting to the money. Samuel pulled the note back, his thumb and forefinger working the edge. He folded the bill, pressing it against the edge of the stall. He tore it. The sound of the paper splitting was loud in the quiet alley. He separated the $200 for the meal. He tucked the remaining $300 deep into his pocket. He placed the $200 on the counter. The transaction was complete. Samuel turned away from the stall, his hand instinctively dropping to his side. He pressed his palm against the fabric of his pocket. The $300 was there, a cold, hard lump against his thigh. It felt different now. It was no longer just currency. It was a physical anchor. He walked back toward the metal shutter, his gait changing. He moved with a deliberate, measured pace, testing the sensation of the weight with every step. He shifted his hip, feeling the paper slide slightly against his skin, a constant, tangible reminder of his choice. The alley air felt cooler, sharper, but he did not pull his shoulders in. He leaned back against the rusted metal of the shutter, the grit biting into his shoulder blades. He kept his hand pressed firmly against the pocket, closing his fingers around the hidden treasure. The frantic pulse in his chest had slowed to a steady, rhythmic thrum. He looked out at the street, the flickering amber light of the stall casting long, distorted shadows across the concrete. The money was a shield, a secret, and a promise. He held it, and in the silence of the alley he felt the first true stability he had known in months. The meal was gone, yet the hunger remained. It was a sharp, persistent ache, gnawing at his ribs like a trapped animal. Samuel pressed his hand against his midsection, feeling the hollow space beneath his skin. He inhaled deeply, the scent of the food still clinging to his fingers, but the satisfaction he had expected was absent. He looked down at the empty plastic plate discarded on the ground. It was a fragile, discarded thing. He shifted his weight, his feet finding purchase on the uneven concrete. The hunger was still there, a constant, biting reality. But the frantic, clawing desperation that had dominated his morning was gone. It had been replaced by a strange, cold clarity. He stood tall, his breathing steady, no longer searching the shadows for a way to fill the void. The gnawing in his gut was no longer a master to be obeyed. He looked at his hands, steady and still. The panic had evaporated, leaving behind a quiet, focused resolve. Samuel walked back to the metal shutter, his movements slow and deliberate. He reached the rusted surface and leaned his weight against it, the cold metal biting into his back. He slid down, his knees bending until he sat on the gritty concrete. He stretched his legs out, his heels digging into the dirt. Above him, the city lights of Halfway Tree began to blur, merging into streaks of amber and white against the black sky. He did not fight the exhaustion. He let his head rest against the corrugated steel, the vibration of a passing car rattling through the frame. He pressed his hand against his pocket, feeling the crisp, folded texture of the $300. It was a solid, undeniable weight. He watched the light patterns shift, his eyes tracking the movement without the frantic darting. The hunger was still a dull ache. He remained still, a fixed point in the shifting shadows. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them, staring into the dark with a calm intensity. The alley remained silent, save for the distant hum of traffic. Samuel sat motionless, his back pressed firmly against the corrugated metal. Then, a soft scraping sound broke the stillness. A stray cat emerged from the shadows near the dumpster, its ears twitching toward the sound of a distant siren. It moved with a fluid, predatory grace, stepping over a discarded plastic bag and pausing to sniff at a puddle of stagnant water. Samuel did not flinch. He did not look away. He watched the creature with a new, sharp focus, tracking the rhythmic twitch of its tail and the way its eyes reflected the faint amber glow from the street lamp above. The cat hesitated, glancing toward the shutter where Samuel sat, then continued its path across the grit. Samuel followed its movement, his head turning slowly, his gaze locked onto the small, dark shape as it navigated the debris. He saw the world differently now. It was no longer a blur of threats. The cat disappeared into the darkness behind a pile of crates, but Samuel kept his eyes fixed on the spot where it had vanished. The temperature in the alley began to plummet. A sharp, biting wind whipped around the corner of the brick building, carrying the metallic tang of the city. It rattled the loose edges of the shutter and sent a swirl of grit dancing across the concrete. Samuel felt the cold seep into his limbs, a familiar sensation that usually triggered a desperate, shivering need for warmth. He felt his muscles tense, an automatic response to the drop in heat. But he did not shiver. He did not pull his arms tight against his chest or hunch his shoulders. He remained braced against the metal, his posture rigid and calm. His hands stayed pressed firmly against his pocket, his fingers curled around the edges of the remaining cash. The paper was cool, solid, and unyielding. It acted as a physical barrier between him and the biting air. Every time the wind gusted, he squeezed the bills, grounding himself in the reality of what he held. The uncertainty of the night remained, but the panic that usually accompanied it had been replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. He was no longer drifting. He was anchored by the weight in his pocket, a shield against the encroaching dark. He watched the debris settle, his breathing slow and measured, entirely unaffected by the cold. The city continued its relentless rhythm beyond the alley, but here, the silence was absolute. Samuel shifted his weight, feeling the hard, unyielding concrete beneath him. He was still hungry. The ache in his ribs remained a constant, dull reminder of his situation. He was still alone, tucked into the shadows of a city that rarely looked down. Yet, the frantic, clawing desperation that had defined his existence for weeks was gone. He looked at the $300 in his pocket one last time, his fingers tracing the edges of the bills. This was not just money. It was the physical manifestation of his first real choice. He had held the power to consume and vanish, but he had chosen to endure and remain. He closed his eyes, letting the sounds of the distant traffic fade into a rhythmic hum. The cold air brushed against his face, but he did not seek shelter. He sat perfectly still, letting the reality of his decision settle into his bones. He knew the path ahead would not be easy, but he had crossed a threshold. He had proven to himself that he was capable of restraint, capable of planning, and capable of holding onto his future. He leaned his head back against the metal shutter, his breathing steady and deep. This was only the beginning. He knew that this choice would not be his last.